All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Now, we've spent plenty of time in the past analyzing the clinical mechanics of distressed companies, but today we are purposefully bypassing the spreadsheets. We aren't going to talk about the standard turnaround methodologies or those clinical step-by-step models again. Instead, we're focusing entirely on the leader's internal spiritual condition. We really want to explore what happens inside the actual person holding the recovery plan and exactly why the source material highlights faith and spiritual resilience as the ultimate integral foundation of any true turnaround.
You know, it's really fascinating how this source uses ancient wisdom as a direct diagnostic tool for a modern executive's 3 a.m. crisis. Think about it. Every single number in a distressed company's report was entered, deferred, or hidden by a human hand, and that hand answers directly to a human heart. The framework here argues that if your heart is being ruled by fear or pride, well, there is literally no strategy document on earth that can save your balance sheet. So this scripture isn't just, devotional decoration. It's presented as a totally foundational operating principle.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The unseen patient. 2. Grit versus divine grace. 3. Solace and Lament. 4. The guarantor of pillars. 5. Biblical wisdom under fire. And finally, 6. The legacy mindset. Let's get right into it.
Okay, Section 1. The unseen patient. Diagnosing the inner man.
We really have to look at the psychological wounds that strike a leader long before they ever hit the company's bottom line. Corporate distress essentially produces two related but very distinct wounds, fear and shame. Fear is future-facing, right? It's the anticipation of a loss, like the panic of maybe missing payroll next week. And honestly, in modest doses, fear can actually be pretty useful because it sharpens your attention. But shame? Man, shame is past-facing. It's a private verdict you pass on your own self-worth. So the absolute crucial point to understand here is that while fear can sometimes sharpen you, hidden shame completely paralyzes your decision-making. A leader gripped by shame will start hiding bad news just to protect their own identity.
Moving right along to Section 2, Grit versus Divine Grace.
We hear a ton about resilience and grit in modern business literature, don't we? But the source highlights a massive difference between secular endurance and divine grace during a prolonged corporate crisis. Think of grit as being entirely self-generated, kind of like a fuel tank. Under sustained pressure, your willpower just depletes. It empties out and absolutely requires physical rest and time to refill. But grace, in a theological sense, is received. It's not a tank that depletes, it's more like a tap connected to an infinite source. It's drawn upon, not drawn down. When you're in the messy middle of a massive turnaround, relying solely on your own exhaustible grit is incredibly dangerous.
And this biblical promise just completely flips the secular playbook on its head. Modern culture tells you to hide your weakness at all costs and project total strength, right? Fake it till you make it. But the text argues that spiritual strength actually begins the exact moment we admit our own weakness. For a leader in distress, finally realizing that you don't have to somehow generate all the strength yourself, that is profoundly freeing.
All right, Section 3, Purpose, Solace, and Lament.
So, what should you actually do with the heavy grief and fear that a slick corporate strategy document just cannot fix? How do you mentally process the reality of a struggling business? Well, modeled right out of the Psalms, this 4-step lament to action cycle shows us a structured, healthy way to process it. First, you have to name the fear out loud. Second, say it to a trusted person. Third, lay it down through prayer or even just a deliberate pause. And only then take the next step. Actually, scratch that. So many executives want to skip straight to step 4. They just rush into action. But taking a moment of solace isn't being in denial. It's a necessary reset. Without it, your decisions are just going to be driven by pure panic rather than purpose.
This brings us to Section 4, the guarantor of pillars.
Now, this right here maps the exact cause and effect relationship between the leader's soul and the company's success. Think about the other 8 pillars of turnaround methodology we've covered in past explainers. Look at financial health. It gets utterly destroyed by the inner shame that delays honest reporting. Operational excellence, that gets killed by a leader's fatigue and fear of conflict. This shows us exactly how a broken inner life actively dismantles your external business metrics. And this is exactly why the source argues faith is so incredibly integral to the whole process. You can execute the other 8 turnaround methodologies absolutely perfectly, but if the leader is compromised on the inside, those external pillars are going to crumble.
Let's make this super real for a second. Put yourself in a founder's shoes the night before a massive make-or-break bank meeting. You've got 2 presentations sitting on your desk. One is technically defensible but overly optimistic. It's the one that secures your loan. The other is the raw, painful, ugly truth. This is the exact moment where your internal integrity is violently tested. So what do you do?
When you break down the deep motivations behind that choice, there are really 4 decision poles at play. Self-interest just tells you to protect yourself, right? Rule-keeping tells you to do the absolute bare legal minimum. Now, the desire for a principled outcome is definitely better, but true, unshakable ethical behavior, that stems from knowing you are accountable to God when absolutely nobody else is watching you.
The source grounds that whole rosy deck dilemma beautifully with this specific scripture. It argues that ancient biblical wisdom demands uncompromising honesty in our financial reporting. Presenting the rosy deck isn't just a clever, pragmatic business move. According to this wisdom, a false balance is literally unacceptable. The spiritual pillar dictates that you present the true numbers, trusting that your integrity is the ultimate currency of any real turnaround.
All right, Section 5, Biblical Wisdom Under Fire.
What is just so fascinating about these historical figures is that literally none of them waited for a values-aligned employer. Think about it. Joseph didn't demand Pharaoh become a believer before he agreed to manage the grain crisis. Esther risks her own life inside a pagan court. They practiced absolute, uncompromising integrity inside incredibly ungodly, hostile systems. They didn't try to fix the system's theology first. They just stayed faithful right where they were.
A perfectly brilliant example of this is David, who refused to assassinate his rival, King Saul, when he had the absolute perfect opportunity to do so. I mean, Saul was actively hunting David down, yet David flat out refused to take a ruthless shortcut to power. This is the ultimate testament to restraining your own self-interest and trusting God's timing over a seemingly pragmatic business shortcut. It's all about knowing there is a much higher authority than your own immediate survival.
And finally, Section 6, the legacy mindset.
As we start to wrap up this explainer, we really have to look past the immediate crisis and focus on the long-term impact of a spiritually healthy leader, remembering that distress is a diagnosis, not a destiny. When Jack and Pete Hershend were facing immense distress with their early theme park business, they literally sat on a log by a creek and made a foundational choice. They didn't just sit there and brainstorm a fancy new marketing strategy. No, they made a covenant to invite God to run their distressed business. And guess what? They transformed a moment of sheer survival into a multi-generational legacy that became Hershend Family Entertainment, eventually partnering with massive names like Dolly Parton. They anchored their entire business to a purpose far, far bigger than themselves.
So here's the absolutely crucial question you need to take away today. When the spreadsheets inevitably fail, and when your own grit completely runs out, what is the unseen spiritual purpose that's going to keep you standing in the room? Recovering your balance sheet is definitely important, sure, but recovering the integrity of your soul, that is the true turnaround. Think deeply about this question, and I'll catch you on our next explainer.